Good morning, my name is Keast and I've titled today's message, Focus on the Big Picture, but mainly because I wanted to talk about the Deuteronomy reading where God shows Moses the promised land but tells him he is not going to enter there, and the Matthew reading where the Pharisees try to trick Jesus by asking him which is the most important of the commandments Moses was given from God. Two hugely powerful readings, and I wondered how they might link up. Each one is deserving almost of a series of sermons by itself. There is one classical book called Your God is Too Small, which challenges the reader's perception of God. Today, I would like not to challenge, but to encourage you to focus on the big picture, if at all possible. You might have issues such as loneliness, stress, HSC exams, health issues, or financial concerns. I believe that, unlike us sometimes, our God is big enough to focus on the big picture, but has the ability to deal with the small issues in your life and my life as well. I was reminded by God this week that he was around in 1964 to support me when I was doing the Leaving Certificate at Hurlston Agricultural High School at Glenfield. So he probably has plenty of experience in supporting his people as they commence their higher school certificate. Also, he reminded me that a student cannot take study notes, parents, or friends into an exam room. When a student goes in, there is no option for phoning a friend, taking a 50-50, or swapping the question. But a student can take God's presence with him or her into the exam room to bring them a sense of peace and purposefulness as they complete their paper. You see, God can focus on the big picture, but also care for the small details at the same time. I believe our role is to keep a correct perspective on matters and not let ourselves get gate-crashed by the small details. Let's commence with the story of Moses and God on Mount Nebo, where God shows Moses the promised land but reminds him he will not enter into it. A hugely powerful passage reflecting on God's relationship with Moses. And I'm so glad that Sunjay and I have had so much fun with our stories of Moses and God over the last few years. I believe we cannot look at this passage without putting it into the full context of Moses' life, or even into the life of God's people. God certainly had a focus on the big picture. If we work our way back to Joseph and his coloured coat, we can trace God's people as they moved into Egypt to escape the famine. However, as the pharaohs changed, the people moved from guests in the country to slaves. So the story of Moses goes way back. The final chapter in Deuteronomy is so much more than just the passage we've heard read to us today. We can start with Moses in the bulrushes. God was with him then, and he was saved in a miraculous way from death as a young child. Moses had a troubled upbringing as he was torn between the two races, his birthrights and his adopted family. However, at no point did God take his attention from Moses, despite some poor decisions by Moses. Moving through life, Moses encountered the burning bush and heard the voice of God. Moses decided he couldn't do what God asked of him and gave numerous excuses to God why he would not go to Pharaoh. But God continued to hold on to his bigger vision for Moses and his people. The Passover, where people put the blood of the lamb on their doors, heralded the opportunity for Moses to lead God's people out of Egypt. And so began the 40-year journey towards the promised land. There were highlights and lowlights. Moses was 80 when he left Egypt. The section referred to by the Pharisees in the Matthew reading is a feature of the journey and became the basis for God's law for his people. The Pharisee in Matthew's reading is identified as an expert in religious law. However, sadly, his expertise is limited to an academic knowledge, looking, as it were, down a tunnel. He was not able to focus on the big picture that maybe this Jesus was the real deal. They were also engrossed in trapping Jesus and scoring points. The final versions, going from bad to worse. The final verses in this Deuteronomy reading are so powerful. That might not be the right word I want, but I can't think of an alternative at the moment. What a description to be called the servant of God. At the age of 120 years, we can identify that God certainly had a big vision and focus for this man, and we should be encouraged that he who had called Joseph also has a plan for us, for you and for me. So we come to our final section, as Jesus is again confronted by the church leaders as they seek to challenge his life, his message and his way. They focus on small issues in an attempt to discredit Jesus and to restore authority and power for themselves. I enjoyed mulling over their conversation. They clearly set themselves up in opposition to Jesus as the authority, the power and the church. It is a good reminder to me to remember not to try and take over when I should be trusting Jesus for the future. I should not be afraid, as they were, that if I released power and authority in my life, it would all go astray. Jesus calls us to trust in him, and God reminds us he does have a bigger plan for our lives. Just as he watched over Moses for 120 years, so we can expect him to do that for us. The Pharisees were only interested in one area, where they thought they might be able to track Jesus. The timeline I have on the sheet lists only half a dozen key figures from the Old and the New Testament: Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David, Solomon, Isaiah, and John the Baptist. Each has a huge story to tell and share to give us knowledge and understanding of our God. Yet these men, the Pharisees, sought only to trap Jesus and pick one little bit to bait the trap. They were not interested in what Jesus had to say or in any of the relationships people in the Old Testament had with God. We can learn a lot from looking at Old Testament characters and their involvement with God, but only if we are open-minded and willing to look beyond our immediate issues. The response Jesus made to this expert in religious law is, of course, the basis for a series of sermons in itself. We can read and sing about it and see if it's the basis for a new commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and love all mankind as you would love yourself. To conclude, I do believe God calls us to focus on the big picture, as he does, with the assurance that he can and will look after the small details. Don't get hung out to dry on little issues, but trust him for their resolution. He didn't let the people at the top of that page down, nor those I mentioned at the start of the service when I listed some books above me in my study. Why would you think God is going to change his character now and not care for you? I'll ask that again. Why would you think God is going to change his character now and not care for you? For homework, you could look up 5 or even 10 or more verses from the Bible, from music, or from your other readings that emphasise God's faithfulness and God's love for his people. You could start with our hymns from today. They reflected on God's greatness and faithfulness. Thank you. Amen.